My name is Ethan Wallace, and this is the story of the day I learned that being underestimated can become your greatest weapon. I'm telling you this from my corner office now, 3 years later, but I need to take you back to that conference room in Chicago, where everything changed, where I sat in silence while my colleagues laughed at my expense, not knowing I was about to rewrite all the rules. To continue listening to this beautiful and special story, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Write your name and the city you're watching from so I can include a special shout out for you in an upcoming story. Chapter 1: The Boy Who Learned to Disappear. I grew up in Asheville, North Carolina, where the mountains teach you humility and your grandmother teaches you that good work speaks louder than loud voices. My daddy was a carpenter who never met a problem he couldn't solve with his hands, and my mama was a librarian who believed words had power when used sparingly. They raised me to believe that if you did excellent work, people would notice. They raised me to trust the process. That philosophy worked fine in a small town where everyone knew your family name and your reputation preceded you. But when I packed my beat-up Honda Civic and drove 12 hours north to Chicago in 2019, I quickly learned that the big city operated on different rules. Here, perception mattered as much as performance. Volume mattered as much as value. And I was still the quiet kid from the mountains, believing my work would speak for itself. The first time I walked into the glass towers of downtown Chicago, feeling the lake wind cut through my thrift store suit, I knew I was out of my element. But I also knew I belonged there. I had something to prove, not just to the city, but to myself. I was 26, fresh out of my master's program, and hungry in a way that only small-town kids understand when they finally get their shot at the big leagues. Sterling and Associates was everything I dreamed of working for. 30 floors up in the Willis Tower, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Lake Michigan, clients whose brands you'd recognize from Super Bowl commercials. The kind of place where ideas became empires and campaigns changed culture. When they offered me a junior strategist position, I felt like I'd won the lottery. I thought I was home. What I didn't understand yet was that in places like Sterling and Associates, being right wasn't enough. You had to be right and loud. You had to be brilliant and brash. You had to command attention, not just earn it. And me, I was still operating on mountain time, believing that good work would rise to the surface like cream. Chapter 2: Learning the Language of Corporate Theater. My first year at Sterling was like learning to speak a foreign language. Every meeting was a performance. Every presentation was theater. Every casual conversation by the coffee machine was the audition for the next big opportunity. I watched my colleagues, guys like Marcus Chen who could make a grocery list sound like a TED Talk, or Sarah Rodriguez, who commanded rooms with the flick of her wrist, and I tried to decode their secret. They weren't necessarily smarter than me. I could see that in the work they produced, in the strategies they pitched, in the campaigns they launched, but they had something I didn't have: presence. They filled spaces with their energy. They made people lean in when they spoke. They turned ideas into movements with nothing but confidence and charisma. Meanwhile, I was the guy in the back corner, taking detailed notes, catching mistakes others missed, developing insights that would later show up in other people's presentations. I was good at my job, really good. My analyses were thorough, my strategies were sound, my execution was flawless. But in a world where perception was reality, I was invisible. My annual review that first year was a masterclass in damning with faint praise. "Ethan is a solid contributor," my supervisor wrote. "His work is consistently reliable and well-researched. He would benefit from developing stronger communication skills and executive presence." Translation: you're smart, but you're boring. You're capable, but you're forgettable. I spent that weekend walking along the lakefront, watching the waves crash against the rocks, feeling the familiar sting of being misunderstood. Back home, being steady and reliable was a virtue. Here it was a liability. I had two choices: change who I was to fit their mold, or find a way to make who I was work in their world. I chose neither. Instead, I decided to get so good at what I did that they'd have no choice but to notice me. I would outwork, outthink, and out-strategize everyone in that building. I would become indispensable through sheer competence. It was a naive plan, but it was the only plan that felt true to who I was. Chapter 3: The Project That Changed Everything. 2 years in, I was still the reliable guy in the corner, when Marcus Chen got promoted to creative director and immediately started reshuffling the deck. New hierarchy, new dynamics, new opportunities for people to prove themselves. That's when the Millennium Foods account landed on our desks, a regional grocery chain looking to rebrand and expand nationally. It was worth $3.2 million in billings, the kind of account that could make career. Marcus assembled his dream team: Sarah Rodriguez on account management, Tommy Liu on creative, Jessica Park on media strategy, and then, almost as an afterthought, he added me to handle research and competitive analysis. The supporting role, the background player, the guy who'd make everyone else look good with solid data and insights. I should have been frustrated, but honestly, I was grateful. Finally, a project where I could sink my teeth into something meaningful. I spent the next month living and breathing Millennium Food. I visited their stores in Milwaukee, Indianapolis, and Detroit. I talked to customers in checkout lines. I studied their supply chain, their distribution networks, their vendor relationships. I analyzed their competitors down to the penny per unit pricing strategy. What I discovered was fascinating. Millennium Foods wasn't just another grocery chain. They were accidentally brilliant at something none of their competitors had figured out: community integration. Their stores became neighborhood gathering places. Their local sourcing programs supported regional farmers in ways that created genuine emotional connections. They had a story worth telling, but they didn't know how to tell. I drafted a comprehensive strategy that positioned Millennium not as a grocery store, but as a community marketplace, a place where neighborhoods came together around food, culture, and connection. It was bold, it was different, and it was completely authentic to who they already were. I was proud of it in a way I hadn't been proud of work in years. When I presented my findings to the team, you could feel the energy shift in the room. Sarah leaned forward. Tommy started sketching. Jessica pulled out her phone to make notes. Even Marcus, who usually treated my contributions like necessary paperwork, sat up and paid attention. "This is good, Wallace," he said, and I felt something warm spread through my chest. "Really good. This could be the angle we've been looking for." For the first time since I'd arrived in Chicago, I felt like I belonged in that room, like my voice mattered, like the quiet kid from the mountains might actually have something valuable to contribute to the big city conversation. Chapter 4: The Moment Everything Shifted. The presentation to Millennium Foods was scheduled for Thursday morning, 10 a.m. sharp. I'd spent the previous week refining every slide, rehearsing every transition, anticipating every possible question. This wasn't just another client meeting for me. It was my audition for a seat at the grown-ups table. My chance to prove that the quiet strategist in the corner had been worth the investment all along. Tuesday afternoon, Marcus called me into his office. The late afternoon sun was streaming through his floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across his polished desk. He was wearing that expression I'd learned to recognize, the one that meant he was about to deliver news that would sound positive but feel like a gut punch. "Ethan, I've been thinking about the Millennium presentation," he started, leaning back in his leather chair. "Your strategy work has been exceptional, really top-tier stuff, but I'm concerned about the presentation itself. This is a big client. High stakes." He paused, searching for the diplomatic way to say what we both knew he meant. "I think we need someone with more executive presence to deliver the message." The words hit me like cold water. I felt my face flush, that familiar heat of humiliation creeping up my neck. "I see," I managed, keeping my voice level even as my hands clenched under the table. "It's not personal," Marcus continued, though we both knew it was entirely personal. "It's about playing to everyone's strength. You're brilliant at strategy, but Tommy has more natural charisma when it comes to selling ideas. He'll take the lead on the presentation, and you'll support from the technical side." Tommy Liu, the creative director who'd been with the company for 8 months, who was charming and confident, and everything I wasn't, who would be presenting my work, my insights, my strategy as if they were his own discoveries. I wanted to argue, to fight for what was mine, but the mountain-bred politeness my mama had drilled into me held my tongue. "Of course," I heard myself saying, "whatever's best for the client." That night, I sat in my studio apartment, overlooking the L tracks, listening to the trains rattle past my window, and felt something fundamental shift inside me. I'd played by their rules for 3 years. I'd been patient, reliable, supportive. I'd waited for merit to be recognized, for good work to speak for itself, and where had it gotten me? Watching someone else prepare to take credit for the best work I'd ever done. I opened my laptop and began typing an email, not to Marcus, not to the team, but directly to Rebecca Thompson, CEO of Millennium Foods. It was a risk that could cost me my job, but sitting there in the dark, listening to the city hum outside my window, I realized I was already losing everything that mattered to me anyway. Chapter 5. The email that changed the game. Dear Ms. Thompson, I typed, my fingers moving before my brain could talk me out of it. My name is Ethan Wallace, and I'm the senior strategist at Sterling & Associates, working on your rebranding project. I'm reaching out because I believe there's an approach to your brand story that deserves your direct consideration. I spent the next 3 hours crafting that email. Not the corporate speak I'd learned to mimic, but the clear, honest communication style my daddy had taught me when explaining why a joint needed to be cut just so, or why you couldn't rush good work. I told Rebecca Thompson what I'd discovered about her company, not just the data and metrics, but the soul of what made Millennium Foods special. I explained how their stores had become the heartbeat of neighborhoods in ways that Amazon and Walmart could never replicate. How their commitment to local sourcing wasn't just good business, it was community building. How their employees didn't just work there, they invested there, creating relationships that turned transactions into connection. Then I attached something that could get me fired, my original strategy document, the full version, with all the insights and recommendations that wouldn't fit into Thursday's presentation. The roadmap for turning Millennium Foods from a regional grocery chain into a national movement. I'm sharing this with you directly, I wrote, because I believe your company's story is too important to be filtered through corporate presentation theater. You deserve to hear it straight from the person who discovered it. I hit send before I could lose my nerve, then closed my laptop and tried to pretend I hadn't just committed career suicide. But lying there in the dark, listening to the city breathe around me, I felt something I hadn't felt in years, like I'd finally acted like the man my parents had raised me to be. Wednesday morning, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. Mr. Wallace, this is Rebecca Thompson. Your email was exactly what I needed to read. Would you be available for a brief call this afternoon? RT. My hands were shaking as I typed back. Of course, I'm available whenever works for you. The call lasted 47 minutes. Rebecca Thompson had the kind of voice that commanded attention. Warm but direct, personal but professional. She built Millennium Foods from 3 stores to 37 over 15 years. And she knew her business inside and out. What she appreciated about my approach, she said, was that I'd seen what she'd been trying to articulate for years, that grocery stores could be community anchors, not just commodity distributors. Your team at Sterling is talented, she told me, but your email suggests you understand something they don't. You see the story behind the strategy. That's rare in this business. By the time we hung up, she'd asked me to prepare a separate presentation of my recommendation. Not instead of Thursday's meeting, she clarified, but in addition to it, I want to hear both approaches before making any decision. I spent Wednesday night preparing for the presentation of my life, knowing that by Thursday afternoon, I'd either be the guy who took a principled stand, or the guy who got fired for going around his boss. Either way, I'd finally stopped being invisible. Chapter 6. The morning that exposed everything. Thursday morning arrived with the kind of October chill that cuts through your jacket and reminds you that winter in Chicago doesn't ask permission. I got to the office early, as usual, but this time it wasn't out of habit. It was because I couldn't sleep. My separate presentation to Rebecca Thompson was scheduled for 2 p.m. 3 hours after Sterling's official pitch, and I spent the morning running through my slides one more time. The Sterling conference room was buzzing with pre-meeting energy when I arrived at 9:30. Tommy was practicing his opening remarks. Sarah was arranging materials. Jessica was testing the projector. Marcus was doing what Marcus did best, commanding the room with his presence, making everyone feel like they were part of something important. Wallace, he called out when he saw me. Ready for the big show? Your research is going to make us all look like heroes today. I nodded and took my usual seat. Back corner. Notebook ready. Prepared to watch someone else present my work. But something was different this time. I wasn't shrinking into the background. I was watching, learning, prepared. At 10 a.m. sharp, Rebecca Thompson walked into our conference room with 2 members of her executive team. She was exactly what I'd expected from our phone call. Confident without being intimidating. Warm without being soft. She shook hands around the room, making eye contact with everyone, including me. "Mr. Wallace," she said when she reached my corner. "I'm looking forward to hearing the team's presentation." There was something in her tone, not quite a wink, but a subtle acknowledgement that we shared information the rest of the room didn't have. I felt Marcus glance between us, his eyebrows raising slightly. But before he could ask any questions, Tommy was launching into his opening. I have to admit, Tommy was good. He had the charisma Marcus had promised, the stage presence I lacked. He presented my community marketplace concept with enthusiasm and polish, walking Rebecca through the strategy with confidence and flair. Watching him, I understood why Marcus had made the switch. In a head-to-head comparison of presentation skills, Tommy would win every time. But I also noticed something else. He was presenting the surface of my strategy, without really understanding its depth. He hit the key points, showed the right slides, delivered the main conclusions. But when Rebecca asked follow-up questions about implementation timelines, about competitive differentiation, about the research methodology behind our insights, Tommy started stumbling. "That's a great question," he kept saying, then turning to me. "Ethan, you want to jump in on the technical details?" The first time it happened, I smoothly provided the context. The second time, I filled in the gaps he'd missed. By the third time, it was becoming obvious to everyone in the room that Tommy was presenting ideas he didn't fully understand, while I was the guy who actually knew what we were talking about. I could see the realization dawning on Rebecca's face, and I could see Marcus starting to sweat. Chapter 7. The Replacement that broke the camel's back. 20 minutes into Tommy's presentation, something shifted in the room's energy. Rebecca was asking increasingly detailed questions about customer segmentation data, and Tommy was running out of smooth ways to deflect to me. You could feel the tension building like humidity before a thunderstorm. That's when Marcus made the decision that changed everything. "You know what?" he interrupted, standing up with a casual smile. "I think we're getting a bit too deep into the weeds here. Tommy, why don't you take a seat and let Ethan walk through the technical details? He's our data guy." The words hung in the air like smoke. Our data guy. Not the strategist who'd developed the core concept. Not the researcher who'd uncovered the insights driving their entire approach. The data guy. The supporting player. The person you call in to explain the complicated stuff so the important people can get back to the big picture. I felt every eye in the room turn to me, and for a moment, I was paralyzed. This was it, the moment I'd been working toward for 3 years. My chance to present my work to a client who understood its value. And it was being handed to me like a consolation prize. A technical cleanup after the real presentation had fallen apart. But then something unexpected happened. Rebecca Thompson looked directly at me and said, "Actually, Mr. Wallace, before we dive into details, I'd love to hear your perspective on the overall strategy. You seem to have a deeper understanding of the research behind these recommendations." The room went quiet. Marcus's smile faltered for just a second. Tommy looked confused. Sarah and Jessica exchanged glances, and I realized that Rebecca Thompson wasn't just asking a polite question. She was throwing me a lifeline. Or maybe she was throwing me a I stood up, walked to the front of the room, and for the first time in my Sterling & Associates career, I owned the space. I didn't apologize for the transition, didn't defer to Marcus, didn't downplay my role. I simply began talking about the work I'd done, the insights I'd discovered, and the strategy I'd developed. What we discovered about Millennium Foods, I began, isn't just data, it's a story. And that story starts with understanding that you're not really in the grocery business. You're in the community business. For the next 15 minutes, I presented my work the way it was meant to be presented. Not as technical support for someone else's vision, but as a comprehensive strategy, born from genuine insight and careful analysis. I talked about the customers I'd interviewed, the patterns I'd identified, the opportunities I'd uncovered. I presented not just what Millennium Foods could become, but why that transformation mattered. When I finished, the room was silent for a long moment. Then Rebecca Thompson began asking questions. Not the surface-level questions she'd asked Tommy, but deep, strategic questions that demonstrated she understood exactly what I was proposing. Questions that I answered without hesitation, because I'd lived with this strategy for months. Finally, she looked around the room and said, "This has been very enlightening. Thank you for your time." As she gathered her materials, I felt Marcus's eyes on me like laser beams. I'd just done something that couldn't be undone. I'd shown that the Emperor had no clothes, that the presentation skills he'd prioritized over substance had left his golden boy looking like a fraud. I'd violated the unspoken rule of corporate hierarchy. Never make your boss look bad in front of a client. But I'd also done something else. I'd finally shown everyone in that room, including myself, what I was actually capable of when I stopped trying to be invisible. Chapter 8. The silence that said everything. The moment Rebecca Thompson and her team left the conference room, the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus closed the door with a deliberate click that echoed like a gunshot. Tommy was staring at his hands. Sarah was organizing papers that didn't need organizing. And Jessica was suddenly very interested in her phone. I was still standing at the front of the room, next to the presentation screen, feeling like a man who'd just jumped out of an airplane without checking if his parachute was properly packed. "Well," Marcus said, his voice carrying that carefully controlled tone that every corporate employee learns to recognize as a warning. "That was interesting." He walked to the head of the conference table, his fingers drumming a slow rhythm on the polished wood. "Ethan, I'm curious about something." Miss Thompson seemed remarkably well informed about our strategy, almost like she'd seen it before. The question hung in the air like a challenge. I could have deflected, made up some story about industry research, or competitive intelligence. I could have protected myself with plausible deniability and corporate doublespeak. But standing there, having just experienced what it felt like to present my work without apology or compromise, I realized I was done with strategic deception. "I sent her my original strategy document on Tuesday night," I said simply. The silence that followed was the kind that makes you aware of every sound. The hum of the air conditioning, the distant murmur of voices in the hallway, the tick of the wall clock. Sarah stopped pretending to organize her papers. Jessica looked up from her phone. Tommy finally raised his eyes from his hands. Marcus stared at me for a long moment, and I could see him processing the implications. "You did what?" I sent her my complete analysis and recommendation, the version that didn't make it into today's presentation. I kept my voice level, professional. I thought she deserved to see the full scope of the strategic thinking behind her account. "Jesus, Ethan," Tommy whispered. "You went around the team." "I went directly to the client," I corrected, "with work I'd developed, work that I believed in." Marcus sat down heavily in his chair. "Do you understand what you've done? You've undermined the entire team structure, violated protocol, and made us all look like what?" I uninterrupted, surprising myself with my directness. "Like you replaced the person who developed the strategy with someone who didn't understand it. Like you prioritized presentation skills over substance. Like you were more concerned with who delivered the message than whether the message was right." The words came out harder than I'd intended, but I didn't take them back. For 3 years I'd swallowed my frustrations, accepted my role, played the team game. But sitting in that room, watching the aftermath of my first act of professional rebellion, I realized something important. I wasn't angry about being replaced in the presentation. I was angry about being invisible for so long. Marcus stood up, his jaw tight. "Pack up your materials, Ethan. We'll discuss this in my office in 10 minutes. As I gathered my laptop and notebooks, I caught Sarah's eye. She gave me the smallest nod. Not approval exactly, but something like understanding. Maybe even respect. It wasn't much, but it was the first time anyone at Sterling & Associates had looked at me like I was something other than reliable, steady, forgettable Ethan Wallace. Walking back to my desk, I felt strangely calm. I'd probably just ended my career at Sterling & Associates, maybe in corporate branding altogether, but I'd also done something I'd never done before. I'd fought for my work. I'd refused to be invisible. I'd acted like the man my daddy had raised me to be, not the corporate player I'd been trying to become. My phone buzzed with a text message. Unknown number, but I recognized it immediately. "Mr. Wallace, would you be available for that follow-up conversation at 2? I believe we have much to discuss." RT. I looked around the Sterling & Associates office, the floor-to-ceiling windows, the polished surfaces, the busy hum of people building careers and chasing success. For 3 years this had been my world, my aspiration, my definition of making it. But maybe I thought as I typed my response to Rebecca Thompson, making it wasn't about fitting into their world. Maybe it was about building your own. Chapter 9. The conversation that rewrote my future. Marcus's office felt smaller at 2:15 p.m. than it had that morning. The afternoon sun was harsh through his windows, casting sharp shadows across his desk, where my termination paperwork sat in a neat stack. He delivered the news with corporate efficiency. Violation of protocol, breach of trust, effective immediately. I had 30 minutes to clear out my desk. I should have felt devastated. 3 years of building a career, gone in one impulsive decision. My Chicago dreams crumbling like lake ice in spring. But sitting there, listening to Marcus explain why I was being let go, all I felt was relief. The pretending was finally over. I hope you understand this isn't personal, Marcus said as I signed the papers. But we can't have team members going rogue, no matter how good their intentions. I nodded, understanding perfectly. In Marcus's world, loyalty meant more than competence, process meant more than results, and fitting in meant more than standing out. I'd never been going to succeed there. Not really. I'd just been too afraid to admit. 20 minutes later I was sitting in a coffee shop 3 blocks away, my Sterling & Associates keycard and company laptop in a cardboard box beside me, waiting for Rebecca Thompson. She arrived exactly on time, another thing I'd learned to appreciate about her, and ordered a black coffee before joining me at the corner table. "So," she said, settling into her chair with the directness I was beginning to recognize as her signature style. "I'm guessing the conversation with your team didn't go well." I laughed, surprising myself. "That would be accurate. I'm officially unemployed as of about an hour ago." She studied my face, looking for signs of regret or panic. Finding neither, she smiled. "Good. I was hoping you'd say that." For the next 2 hours, Rebecca Thompson changed my life. She explained that Millennium Foods wasn't just looking for a branding agency. They were looking for a strategic partner who understood their vision and could help them execute it. Someone who saw grocery retail as community building, not just commodity distribution. Someone who could think beyond campaigns to long-term positioning and authentic brand development. "Your former colleagues at Sterling are talented," she said, "but they're thinking like advertisers. You're thinking like a strategist. There's a difference." She offered me something I'd never imagined, a direct contract to develop and implement the community marketplace strategy for Millennium Foods. Not as an employee, but as an independent consultant. Not as support for someone else's vision, but as the architect of the entire approach. "The compensation would be significantly more than your Sterling salary," she continued, sliding a folder across the table. "And if the strategy works, if we can successfully rebrand and expand using your approach, there would be equity in the company. A real partnership." I opened the folder and saw numbers that made my head spin. More money than I'd ever imagined making, with the potential for real ownership in a company I believed in. But more than the compensation, what struck me was the respect. Rebecca Thompson wasn't offering me a job. She was offering me a seat at the table where decisions were made. "Why?" I asked. "Why take this risk on someone whose only reference is going to be the company that just fired him?" She leaned back in her chair, considering the question. "Because in 15 years of building this company, I've learned to recognize authenticity. Your email wasn't a sales pitch. It was the truth. Your presentation this morning wasn't performance theater. It was genuine insight, and your willingness to risk your career to make sure I heard your ideas. That tells me everything I need to know about your character." I thought about my daddy, working with his hands, building things that lasted because he refused to cut corners. I thought about my mama, choosing her words carefully because she believed they mattered. I thought about the mountains of North Carolina, where your reputation was built on what you did, not what you said you could do. "When do we start?" I asked. Rebecca Thompson smiled and extended her hand. "We already have." Chapter 10. The decision that changed my destiny. 6 months later, I was standing in the grand opening of Millennium Foods' flagship Chicago store, watching customers flow through aisles designed around the community marketplace concept I'd developed. Local farmers had booths in the produce section. A neighborhood cafe occupied the corner where most stores put self-checkout machines. Community bulletin boards showcased local events and services. It was everything I'd envisioned, and The financial results spoke for themselves. Same-store sales up 23%, customer retention up 31%, and most importantly, a net promoter score that had competitors scrambling to understand what Millennium was doing differently. We weren't just selling groceries, we were creating gathering places, fostering connections, building the kind of community anchors that made neighborhoods stronger. But the real transformation wasn't in the stores, it was in working directly with Rebecca Thompson had taught me things no corporate hierarchy ever could. I learned to trust my instincts, to speak up when I disagreed, to lead with conviction rather than hedge with politeness. I discovered that the quiet kid from the mountains had something valuable to offer the world, if he was brave enough to offer it without apology. The success of the Millennium rebrand led to other opportunities. Word spread in the way it does in business circles, quietly at first, then with increasing momentum. Regional retailers who'd heard about our results started reaching out. Food brands looking for authentic positioning. Even some national chains interested in community-focused strategy. Within a year, I'd launched Wallace Strategic, my own consultancy focused on helping businesses find and tell their authentic stories. Not the stories they thought customers wanted to hear, but the stories that emerged from who they really were. It was the kind of work that felt like calling rather than career, purpose rather than just profession. The irony wasn't lost on me. By refusing to play the corporate game, I'd finally won. By insisting on being authentic rather than impressive, I'd found success beyond anything I'd imagined possible. By choosing substance over style, I'd built something that mattered. Last month I got a LinkedIn message from Tommy Lee. He'd left Sterling & Associates and was looking for strategic consulting work. "I always admired your approach," he wrote. "Would you be interested in grabbing coffee sometime? I'd love to learn from what you've built." I smiled, remembering the conference room where he'd presented my work while I sat in the corner, taking notes. The boy who'd learned to disappear had finally learned to show up. And in showing up, authentically, unapologetically, completely, I'd discovered something my parents had tried to teach me all along. The right people will always recognize real work when they see it. These days, when young professionals ask me for career advice, I tell them the story of that Thursday morning in October. How getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me. How going around the system led me straight to where I belong. How the day they laughed at me being replaced mid-presentation was the day I stopped trying to be someone else and started becoming who I was meant to be. Because here's what I learned in that Chicago conference room. Authenticity isn't a weakness to overcome. It's a superpower to embrace. And sometimes the biggest risk you can take is finally deciding to stop being invisible. Rebecca Thompson was right about one thing. I wasn't thinking like an advertiser. I was thinking like someone who had something real to offer the world. And in the end, that made all the difference.